Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Travis and welcome back to another daily Q&A. So today we're going to be answering a question from I don't know his name. We're going to put it on the screen, and he asked pros and cons of calcium reactor versus dosing, please. So I do have some notes here. I am going to extend this video out to 10 minutes so I can get paid, or I'm sorry, so I can entertain you guys. And yeah, so we're going to talk about why you want to dose in the first place, kind of if you need to dose or how to tell if you need to dose your tank, and then I'm going to go through some pros and cons and stuff like that. Again, trying to make the videos a little bit longer. Now, with that said, if you guys like this type of content, make sure you give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe and go to my website and buy my stuff, and we'll all be happy. So with that said, oh, last thing, it's not herpes. Clarify that before when you guys start running your mouths in the comment section. Now, let's go and get started. So, first thing on the notes here is, why do you dose, or why do we dose our tanks in the first place? So it's very simple. Our tanks, depending on what type of tank it is, and even to a certain extent with soft coral tanks, our corals use up calcium alkalinity. And I'll just use the term calcium alkalinity instead of going into bicarbonate, calcium carbonate, all these crazy other terms. I'm just going to keep it simple. Calcium, alkalinity, magnesium, those are going to be the main elements that I'm going to talk about. But either way, when our corals grow, they're going to pull out a part of calcium, a part of alkalinity, and they're going to use those elements to be able to build their skeletal structure so they can grow into big fat colonies that your fish knock over and land into other colonies and die. Besides that, yeah, so that's basically the point. We have our corals, they're going to grow within our tanks. To a certain extent, even coralline algae uses up calcium and alkalinity. That's why some people are asking, well, I have a soft coral tank, why do I feel like I need to dose? Well, if you have a ton of coralline algae, you're probably going to need to because it's going to use it up. So with that said, corals are going to use up calcium and alkalinity in our tanks as they grow, and we need to replace that either with water changes or a dosing method, calc-washer, 2-part, calcium reactors, and there's some other new stuff up on the market there. But either way, that is the reason why we want to dose our tanks. Now, let's go and talk about the next thing is, how do you know if you need to dose your tank? I got to stop talking so fast. We're only 2 minutes in. I got 8 more to burn here. So, how do you know if you need to dose your tank? Well, it's pretty simple, and I tell most people to start with this. Test your tank right after you do a water change. So if you're doing your water change every week on Sunday, about an hour or two after you do it, just go ahead and test, get a baseline for calcium and alkalinity as well as magnesium. And then before you do your next water change, or even if midweek or whatever, if you're kind of feeling that you're using up the elements quicker, test to see if you're having any dips in alkalinity. Now, if you have a tank that has SPS or LPS, and you're testing right after you do your water change, say you're at 9 DKH and I don't know, 400 or 420 calcium. I'm already talking about that. And let's say you test a week later and you're at 7.5 alkalinity and 360 or just some random number low for calcium. Now, that's a pretty good indication that you need to start dosing. So if you are dropping a point or 2 points in DKH in a week or two, then yes, I would definitely recommend that dosing something would be good just to keep that stability. And that's really what we're looking for, is stability. For example, if I like the 300, which is the tub here connected, then there's some 2 low boys here with corals in it. If I didn't have a calcium reactor or even calc-washer on this tank for a day, it would probably die just because of the sheer amount of uptake, or that these corals are pulling out of the water every single day. I mean, I would say they probably wouldn't die, but they'd be really pissed off. If I went more than a couple days, you could start seeing whole colonies peacing out at that point. So the point is, stability is key for success with this hobby, and dosing, depending on your method and how you go about that, is what's going to aid in that stability, especially with alkalinity, which is one of the more important water parameters when you start getting into SPS, acropores, and all that kind of stuff. It's one of the most important water parameters that we focus on, because that stability in that alkalinity really dictates how successful these corals will become. So with that said, moving on to the next thing here. All right, so let's talk about 2-part dosing. What is 2-part and how does it work? Well, 2-part is technically 3 parts. If you want to get even a little farther, there's technically 4 parts. It's going to be calcium chloride, which is a salt base, and this is all salt base, and we'll talk about the pros and cons of that a little bit later. We got calcium chloride, we got soda ash, which is basically sodium chloride, and then magnesium is usually 2 different salts together. It's going to be magnesium chloride and magnesium sulfate. So they usually combine the 2 magnesiums together to 1, and then you dose that as your third. But hopefully that makes sense. So you are going to be dosing calcium alkalinity either manually or through a dosing pump, and then as your magnesium slowly drops, you can either add in a gallon at a time or whatever the calculator is on like VRS or something like that, or you can just also put that in an automatic doser and kind of trickle it in throughout the month or week or whatever. You just got to test and pretty much go from there. So it is 3 parts, technically 4 if you want to really go into it, but I still don't know why they call it 2-part, but it is what it is at this point. So basically, you're going to be dosing these salt-based products, which are going to go into the water column, and they are going to help supply that calcium alkalinity that your corals are going to need to grow. It is a very basic, and it is one of the pros I'm going to talk about. Starting off with a 2-part is actually recommended for most beginners because it is a very basic, easy to understand, a very easy concept, and it's relatively cheap and, like I said, easy to really get into besides something like kalkwasser or like that. So definitely 2-part is, I don't know, it's just something that I started with. I even bypassed kalkwasser and went to 2-part and was very successful with it up until the point we'll talk about some of the cons here in a minute. So that is your 2-part dosing. Now, when it comes to a calcium reactor, what is that? I'm going to try to keep this very basic because each one of these is an entire video in itself. So I got to keep this as short as possible, but still get the point across. So a calcium reactor is a single or dual chamber reactor that stores media. We'll just think of it as dead coral skeletons. So there are corals that are die out in the ocean. We take those skeletons, we'll bring those skeletons in, we'll clean them up, and then we'll use that as media. Now you might be wondering, how does that actually work? Well, we actually take CO2 gas and we pump that into that chamber, which then drops the pH to the point where it will start to slowly dissolve that media, and then it will then be dripped, or depending on what your consumption is, it could be flown through at a high velocity into your tank, but we'll just call it dripping. But either way, you will break that media down slowly or dissolve it slowly with the CO2 gas, and then it will be dripped into your tank, which then will go in and supply the calcium alkalinity needs of your tank. Now, you might be asking, what about the magnesium? Now, there are some medias out there for calcium reactors that do have magnesium in it, but most of the time I do something like ReaMag. It's an actual different type of media that I will mix percentage base on my new media or whatever I'm dosing in the tank, or putting in the chamber. So hopefully that makes sense. Again, this is that one thing that I mentioned for the last minute and a half is an entire 10 or 15 minute video in itself. But that's essentially what it is. You got media, you're going to dissolve that media using CO2 gas. That media is then going to be dripped through water. You're going to take water from your tank, you're going to go through the reactors, it's going to be dripped into your tank, and then that is going to supply calcium alkalinity to your corals. So yeah, it doesn't sound complicated. That's the easier version of it. It is the more complicated of the methods that we use within the hobby, but there are some really good benefits to it, which we'll talk about here in a second. So with that said, if that makes any sense at all, we're just going to keep going. So anyways, so let's go and talk about some pros of 2-part, because we're already 8 minutes in. I'm definitely getting 10 minutes today. Anyways, pros to 2-part. Well, like I mentioned before, it's good for beginners. It's relatively cheap. I think BRS, you can get the whole kit and caboodle for, I don't know, under $50 or something like that, even if not cheaper, depending on how you want to go about it. Now, there are a couple different methods of dosing. What I recommend is that you start off with a dosing pump. I know that might seem like, oh man, I got to buy another piece of equipment, but it just makes it easier to adjust and easier to move forward. So you can either do 2-part dosing through a dosing pump like a Jabo, or even a dose from Neptune, or you can move over to manual dosing if you so choose to do that, if you're able to do that, and if your system supports that method. Now, what I mean by that is 2-part's really good for taking care of low demand tanks that are not very large. Even, I guess to a certain extent, larger tanks with just not a lot of coral. It's a pretty decent method to use. Now, we're going to still talk about the pros here, and then we'll move into the cons. But so it's cheap. It's easy to implement, it's good for beginners, and it takes care of what you need without really having to invest too much time, energy, or even knowledge into getting it up and working. Now, I do recommend that you always dose equal parts. I have videos on this in the past, and you can check those out. But it's always good to dose equal parts, and then make sure you have your magnesium coming in either by hand or on another dosing head to make sure that you're keeping the correct magnesium levels in the tank. So the reason why you want to have good magnesium is because magnesium in the water column keeps calcium and alkalinity molecules from coming together and precipitating out, messing with all your numbers. So that's why you want to keep those levels good. Anyway, so I can just see beginners watching this shit going, what is this dude talking about? just hold out until, oh, we're at 10 minutes. If you're here, you can leave now. We're good. I'm just playing with you guys. It's one of those days we'll talk about later. Calcium, so let's go and talk about some of the cons to the two-part. The biggest con, which I ran into on the 125, is that it increases the salinity. If you guys remember on that tank, I was dosing 250 milliliters of both per day. And that adds up to a lot of salt being dumped into the tank every single day. And I do have a buddy named Jack who I think he's switching over to a calcium reactor because of this, but his tank uses up so much that he has to do water changes at 1.024 to get it from 1.0 to 7 down enough to be appropriate and close to 1.025 or 26. So if you don't want to have to do water changes like that and deal with that fluctuation, I would say that two-part is probably not going to be a great idea if you have a fully stocked SBS tank. I can tell you now, if I had to do two-part on the system that I have here, I'd be in a lot of trouble, just because it would be a ton of two-part every single day. I can't even imagine. I don't even imagine what that would be. It would be insane. But it would be not only really expensive, it would be a pain in the butt to keep the salinity stable, and it's just one more thing that I got to worry about. So yeah, not doing that. So those are the cons to two-part, and then having the extra dosing pump, which is, it is what it is at this point. We all have equipment. All right, so let's go ahead and let's move down to a calcium reactor. So I got there's quite a bit of pros here. Pros for calcium reactor, hence the reason why I run one. They're awesome. They're pretty cool. So first thing is, it doesn't increase your salinity. That's one of the main things. It strictly just doses what it needs to, and you don't have to worry about your salinity going through the roof. It's better for larger systems with a lot more coral, kind of like what I got going here. Used to have a lot more coral. It's kind of empty now, but anyways, it's good for really large systems, and yeah, it's just a little bit more stable. I mean, you can just, I want to say you can set it and forget it, but there's other things that we have that are attached to a calcium reactor, like pH probes to the apex. We have special CO2 regulators that are just, we can get really, really fancy with a calcium reactor, and it virtually takes care of itself. You just have to make minor adjustments every once in a while. There's just so many positives to a calcium reactor, and I ain't trying to talk it up too much here. The next thing here is includes some trace elements that you wouldn't get normally. So when you dissolve corals and use that to grow other corals, you're going to get all the trace elements and all the benefits that coral used as it was growing and living previously, to dying and becoming media. And you get to use that stuff and dump it back into your tank that your corals can continue to use, just like the ocean. I mean, those corals that are dying out there, they're either turning into rock or breaking down, and that stuff just comes back into the ocean and feeds the corals there. All right, next thing here. This is the most important thing for a calcium reactor, is when people come over to your house, you can look more sophisticated, you can talk a big game, pretend to be smarter than you really are, and then you could possibly start a YouTube channel calling yourself the king of calcium reactors. And yeah, but you're really a piece of shit. But moving on to some cons for the calcium reactor. The upfront cost of a calcium reactor is probably the biggest con. The complexity, the learning curve, those are all things that are going to be cons to a calcium reactor. But as with everything in life, if you truly want to learn it, or you want to dive and go that route, you can. Just put the effort in, take the time to learn it, and then just kind of go about it that way instead of being overwhelmed. But yeah, that's it. I'm trying to think. Okay, so I got one more thing here. The last thing on the list is I recommend, if you have, say, one method, you should have a backup of another method. So I have the calcium reactor, and then I have Kalkwasser, but I also have two-part just in case. So a Kalkwasser reactor is currently down because I got to get the dosing pump fixed, but it's been on the list of things for a while. But yeah, I always recommend you have a backup method just in case. So if my calcium reactor was to take a crap for whatever reason, it is a possibility that I have two-part or calc reactor to put online to keep this tank from crashing. So I definitely recommend stick to one method that you really like, but always have a backup plan, either being calc, two-part, or I mean, I doubt your calcium reactor is your backup plan, but if it is, then kudos to you on that one. But anyways, guys, that's it for this video. I hope it made sense. We're at 14 minutes, so it's pretty good. So anyways, guys, if you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like it or you got offended for any reason, give it a thumbs down, because that helps the channel too, and I'll take whatever I can get at this point. If you want to support the channel, head over to FishOfHex.com. Tons of 3D printing, tons of stuff going on, and I got a video coming out either today or tomorrow about a frag swap coming up in Lancaster, which I'm going to be at. You guys can come hang out, get some free stuff, and yeah. So I'll see you guys later. Peace.